This is episode 4 of Why Men Fight, Bertrand Russell's vision for peace and progress. Today, we ask, why has war become a habit and how can we break it? Welcome to the deep dive. We're diving deep into Bertrand Russell's 1916 book, Why Men Fight, using the sources you've shared to really get a handle on his perspective, specifically how he sees war as this fundamental, almost institutional part of society, even though, yeah, most nations aren't actually fighting most of the time.
That's right. And our mission for this deep dive is, well, to get to the heart of Russell's analysis. He's looking beyond the obvious reasons, the simple explanations like just wanting power or wealth. He really digs into these deeper human impulses and the societal structures that kind of enable war. And then, crucially, he starts thinking about what a world without war could look like, how we might actually get there.
Okay, let's unpack that core argument then. On the surface, Russell's definition of war, it seems pretty straightforward. It's when groups, try to kill or maim each other to get something they want, usually power or wealth. Simple motive, pretty brutal method.
Right. But here's where it gets, well, really interesting. And this is, I think, one of his most powerful points. Russell argues that the real driver isn't always a cold, calculated desire for the results of war. The land, the money, the dominance. Instead, he says it's often driven more by this fundamental impulse toward the activity of war itself, the struggle, the conflict. He suggests people often end up wanting the goal because their nature, their impulses, demand the kind of actions that lead to it.
Wow, okay. So if we were purely rational, if we only acted based on what would genuinely make us happy and secure, then the overwhelming arguments against war, the cost, the suffering, and the sheer destruction they should have ended it centuries ago, right?
Exactly. That's his point. The reason it persists, he thinks, is precisely because it springs from this deep, almost non-rational impulse. It's not coming from some simple cost-benefit analysis that says, oh, this is illogical.
Makes sense. And to sort of sharpen this idea, he contrasts war with how a police force uses force, doesn't he?
He does. It's a key distinction for him. Police action, in theory anyway, is ordered by a neutral, impartial authority, one that represents the whole community and acts according to agreed-upon laws. War, though, that involves the actual parties in the dispute being the ones who decide to use force and then direct it themselves.
Right. Although he does admit the line can get a bit fuzzy sometimes, even domestically, like when a state uses force during strikes or against certain opinions. In those cases, the state isn't exactly neutral, is it? It's kind of involved.
That's a nuance he definitely includes, yeah. It's an important caveat.
Yeah.
But internationally, he argues, the principle was even clearer back then. Before World War I, nations were pretty much seen as the sole judges of when they needed to use force. There wasn't really a higher authority, a world police, judging violations of international law in the same way.
Okay, I see. And so Russell's hope for the future is
Yeah.
an international force that acts more like that domestic police model, a neutral authority.
Precisely. That's where he sees the best hope for lasting peace. But, as things stood then, he points out that diplomatic norms actually prevented neutral countries from stepping in effectively. Unless their own national interests were directly at stake, they generally stayed out.
He makes that analogy, doesn't he, about a police force only intervening in a murder if the victim was one of their own officers.
Yeah, it's a stark analogy. And it highlights his point. As long as international intervention is driven by self-interest rather than law or justice, neutral parties are essentially powerless to prevent war effectively.
That really paints a picture. Okay, so if war is driven by this impulse and enabled by this lack of a neutral structure, what specific forces did Russell see actually pushing nations into war?
He identifies two main forces working together in what he called civilized countries. First, in normal times, there's a relatively small group of people, often educated, aware of world affairs, who have what he calls a bellicose tendency. They're not necessarily unhappy at the prospect of conflict.
Okay, a small group. But they can't start a war on their own, surely.
No. That's where the second force comes in. When war looks imminent, a kind of war fever can suddenly grip the majority of the population. And that provides the broad, enthusiastic support needed for war to actually happen. It sweeps people up.
And are the motivations the same for both groups? The educated elite and the general population caught in the fever?
Not entirely. Russell suggests the educated group's inclination might come from their specific knowledge or worldview, but their fundamental human nature isn't necessarily different. The war fever in the masses, though, he thinks is fueled by a different set of impulses, maybe more primal, less intellectualized.
Let's make this concrete. You mentioned the sources look at his analysis of German policy before World War I. What did he see happening there?
Right. He describes this incredibly intense form of patriotism in Germany at the time. He felt it was, well, almost unique in its focus. The idea was that only German interests mattered. Any potential damage to other countries, destruction of their culture, even harm to civilization itself, it just didn't seem to factor into the calculation if it was perceived to benefit Germany.
And this wasn't just about Germany getting richer or stronger in isolation, was it? It was about how they compared to others.
Exactly. Intensely competitive. It was less about Germany's own intrinsic well-being and more about its relative standing, its power compared to, say, Britain or France.
Which led to some disturbing conclusions, according to Russell.
Yeah, he highlights this idea that seeing good things destroyed elsewhere. He mentions envy of French art, their way of life, English political liberty, how they ran their empire was seen as almost as good as creating something positive at home, primarily driven by envy.
That's quite an accusation. He even suggested some German militarists coldly calculated that war would ruin the best minds in France and England.
He did. He notes this grim satisfaction some seem to take in the potential loss of young French writers, for instance, and any sign of England getting tougher was seen as proof Germany was successfully forcing England to become more like Prussia.
So what was the root of the envy towards Britain specifically?
Primarily Britain's power and wealth. Command of the seas, their industrial dominance. The Germans, Russell says, felt their own perceived superiority in thinking, skills, organization, made Britain's advantage feel unbearable, intolerable without a fight.
And it wasn't just cold calculation, there was real animosity too.
Oh, definitely. He mentions a hot hatred many Germans felt towards the English, particularly those who knew them well. He attributes it partly to English pride, a sort of perceived aloofness. He uses that really vivid analogy from Dante, comparing the English attitude to a disdainful figure in hell and English officers seeing Germans almost like vermin.
That's quite the image, like they were just pests to be swatted away.
Pretty much. He suggests the English initially dismissed the Germans as just an annoyance. It wasn't until military failures started hitting home, affecting them personally, that they might have started seeing Germans as, well, actual human beings rather than just an irritating circumstance.
So looking back at this whole dynamic, England versus Germany, what was Russell's main takeaway?
He basically saw it as a tragedy of mutual folly. The German envy and the English pride, he labels them mythical representatives of pride and envy, cold pride versus hot envy. He argues Germany didn't really have a rational basis for such all-consuming envy, and England didn't have a good reason to just rigidly resist any change, even demands that weren't fundamentally a threat to peace.
So the big question for him was,
Can we avoid this kind of reciprocal foolishness, this destructive dance of national egos and anxieties in the future?
yeah, that really shifts the blame from just one side to a kind of shared psychological trap, which then leads him to that really controversial point he makes about the war while it was happening. He basically said if nations could just put aside pride and think about individual well-being, the smartest thing to do during WWI would have been what? Just stop fighting.
Yes. Make peace immediately, on the best terms possible at that moment. It's a radical thought, especially mid-conflict. He makes the incredibly difficult argument that the ongoing horror of the war, the sheer scale of death and suffering, was actually a far greater evil than even the worst possible outcome an enemy might impose through a peace treaty.
So what stops nations from seeing that? If it's that obvious, why keep fighting?
Pride. Simple, powerful, national pride. It makes accepting defeat seem intolerable. And this pride, he says, masks itself. It pretends to be rational fear. Oh, if we lose, terrible things will happen. But Russell argues the only real evil of defeat is the feeling of humiliation. It's subjective. If a nation could just say, okay, fighting was a mistake, let's focus on other things now, that humiliation wouldn't really stick. National independence, real self-respect, could be preserved.
And he doesn't let England off the hook for creating the pre-war climate either, does he? He suggests England's own attitude contribute.
Absolutely. He argues England's pride in its vast empire, its wealth, and its clear willingness to use force to defend it all well. That showed they operated by the same basic standards as Germany. They valued national power and weren't afraid to fight for it. By insisting on keeping things exactly as they were the status quo, which obviously benefited Britain hugely, they shared responsibility for pushing Germany towards conflict.
It's a powerful point. You can't have peace in a dynamic world if the powerful always insist nothing must ever change.
Right. Nations grow, nations decline. He argues they have to learn to accept changes on the map. even unfavorable ones, without immediately reaching for weapons or feeling utterly humiliated.
He uses that analogy about peace advocates sometimes acting like capitalists who resist all economic change, right?
Right.
By insisting on the status quo, they inadvertently fuel conflict.
Exactly. He felt that sort of static view of peace actually drove Germany towards militarism, because war seemed the only way to gain the kind of empire others already had. For genuine peace, he believed, political methods have to evolve to achieve the kinds of results nations currently fight over. And, crucially, nations must be willing to accept judgments from neutral parties, even when those judgments go against them.
Which brings us right back to his big idea for a long-term
The
solution.
World Federation.
Right.
He's pretty explicit about it. For permanent peace, you ultimately need a single worldwide military authority, one global army and navy. Disputes between nations would be settled by this central body, using force if necessary, but crucially acting as a neutral arbiter, not a party to the dispute.
But he's careful to keep the military side separate from the day-to-day running of countries, isn't he?
Very careful. He actually thinks modern nation-states are often too big for good civil governance, too remote, too centralized. But they're too small militarily because they're not global. So this World Federation's international authority would primarily set rules for how nations interact with each other. It would step in with force if those rules were broken, but it wouldn't dictate, say, internal laws or policies within a member nation.
And he saw hints of this separation already existing.
Yeah, things like South American republics relying on the U.S. Navy for protection against Europe, or the British dominions depending on the Royal Navy. Even alliances like the one in WWI showed distinct nations pooling military power. Protectorates, too.
Okay, so the big advantage of one global military power would be?
It massively increases the area where war between states becomes impossible. Conflict could only happen through internal revolution. Think about, England and Canada settling disputes peacefully, or Manchester and Liverpool not going to war over business. A world federation extends that principle globally.
But he saw downsides too, serious ones.
Definitely. An external war involving such a massive entity would be unimaginably catastrophic, far worse even than WWI. And a single, all-powerful world state could easily become oppressive, especially towards minorities or smaller regions within it. Think of historical examples like England and Ireland, or Prussia and Poland.
Though he hoped democracy could lessen that risk.
He did. The idea being that representative government makes grievances harder to ignore and ensures that if oppression happens, it's usually directed at a minority, which still requires the consent, or at least apathy, of the majority.
So if this World Federation seems like the logical, maybe necessary step for peace, why did he think it was still so far off? Why so difficult to achieve?
He comes back to that fundamental point about human nature, about impulses. The biggest roadblock, he felt, is that a huge chunk of humanity simply has a stronger impulse towards conflict, towards self-assertion, than towards harmony. People cooperate best, he observes, often only when they have a common enemy. This deep-seated urge to quarrel, to get your own way, it's just there, in most people, in most vigorous nations. And that makes a unified world state really, really hard.
But he doesn't leave it there, does he? He offers some hope.
He does. He argues this powerful, vigorous impulse doesn't have to lead to war. It can be channeled differently. Just like, personal duels were eventually replaced by lawsuits and legal processes in civil society, he believed war between nations could be replaced by political contests within a world state.
Yeah.
If we build the right institutions and develop the right habits.
He uses that striking analogy, comparing a nation waging war for some minor gain to a man buying a gun to steal sixpence.
Right. It's almost darkly funny. We see the individual as foolish or criminal, but the nation doing essentially the same thing on a massive, horrific scale that gets praised by historians if it succeeds. It just highlights the collective madness war can involve.
Yeah, it really cuts through the heroic narrative. And he talks about why war has this glamour, doesn't he? The traditions, the myths,
Yeah.
education.
All of it. Tales of heroism, self-sacrifice. He mentions the biblical story of Jephthah sacrificing his daughter, or mothers proudly sending sons off to fight. He sees this celebrated heroism often stemming from what he calls a barbarism in the imaginative outlook. It's like worshiping a god who demands sacrifice, or believing your nation's welfare requires the suffering of millions.
Which leads him to call nationalism the deepest religion of the age.
Exactly. A religion that, like ancient ones, demands terrible things: persecutions, holocausts, cruelties. And disturbingly, he argues that this nationalistic religion often lags behind our private, individual sense of morality. It hardens our hearts against mercy, closes our minds to uncomfortable truths.
So To escape this, what does humanity need to become?
It's a tall order. We need to be noble, but without cruelty. Faithful to our ideals, yet always open to truth. Inspired by purpose, but without hating those who disagree. And achieving this, he says, requires facing a really terrible realization that the national gods we worshipped might have been they were tragically in vain.
And a big part of this transformation is finding other outlets for all that human energy, right? The energy that currently fuels conflict.
Absolutely. He sees those impulses, the desire for adventure, imagination, even the thrill of contest, as vital. They drive progress. The tragedy is when they get channeled into destruction.
He wasn't a fan of just aiming for less work and more leisure, was he?
No. He critiques those kinds of utopias. He argues people need activity, challenge, creativity to be truly fulfilled. If work itself, or other pursuits like art, science, exploration, could provide those outlets for our vigorous impulses, the appeal of war would fade dramatically.
It sounds a bit like William James's moral equivalent of war idea, finding constructive ways to satisfy that need for struggle and achievement.
Very much so. He notes how economic theory often assumes people just want wealth, but look at history. Many driven people thrive on the contest, the joy of succeeding, more than the money itself. Public opinion shapes where that energy goes. Think Renaissance Italy honoring artists versus, say, modern America honoring billionaires.
And even things like politics, social movements, they can channel that competitive spirit.
Yes, relatively harmlessly. Party politics, debates over social issues, even capital versus labor struggles, they engage people, provide an outlet for the love of contest, and can drive positive change. Giving people more agency, more control over their lives and communities makes life less stagnant, less boring, and maybe less likely to seek the artificial excitement of war.
Okay, so let's try and bring Russell's whole view together then. War isn't just about cold, hard calculations of power or grabbing resources.
No, it's much deeper than that. It's rooted in these fundamental human impulses. The need for vigorous activity, the pull of conflict, the assertion of self, and these impulses get amplified and directed by societal structures, especially this incredibly powerful force of nationalism, this worship of the nation state. And it persists because we haven't found enough constructive ways to channel that energy.
So his vision for peace is pretty demanding. It requires a fundamental shift away from acting on instinct and pride.
Towards more rational, diplomatic, political ways of handling conflict, aiming eventually for that world federation with a truly neutral authority. And maybe most importantly, consciously finding ways for individuals and societies to express their energy, their creativity, their drive in ways that build things up instead of tearing them down.
It's definitely a sobering analysis, but there's a thread of hope there too, isn't there? It asks us to look honestly at ourselves, our impulses, and the religions we serve. Russell wrote all this fully aware of how deep these impulses run, how hard change is. So maybe the final thought for you listening is this. If war really does spring from an impulse to conflict and the worship of national idols, what impulses might we need to consciously redirect in our own lives and societies today? And what unquestioned assumptions or loyalties might we need to stop bowing down to if we truly want to build a more peaceful future?